Dame Edna is a strange thing to happen to any actor. She was born, like most of us, by accident in 1955, which makes her quite an old lady, though she wouldn't like to hear us say so. In 1956, the Olympic Games happened in Melbourne, Australia, and there was great excitement. The problem was there was really not enough accommodation for the Olympic athletes and the many visitors who were expected to attend the Games. So there were advertisements in the Melbourne newspapers asking ordinary housewives to give up their spare bedrooms or whatever spare accommodation they had for the visitors. There was a great deal of excitement in 1955 as housewives rushed into the city and offered up their beautiful spare rooms. And I, at the time, was a young student actor working for a small professional theatre company who were planning their Christmas show. It was to be a revue, and we were all going to write songs and sketches for it. And I wrote a piece about one such housewife. I'd written it, in fact, for the actress Zoe Caldwell, now, of course, a multi-Tony Award-winning Broadway star, then a young actor like myself. The director looked at the script, thought it was funny. I'm pleased to say it was the first comic script I'd ever written, but suggested that I play the part of the housewife. I said, no, this is written for Zoe. He said, oh no. He said, you can do it. She's got too many numbers in this production. So, very reluctantly, I found myself playing the role of Edna, because that's what I'd called the character. As a child, I'd had a kind of, well, nurse or nanny called Edna, of whom I was very, very fond. And although I didn't base the character on her, she inspired the name. Some friends of mine called Newton-John, who had a young, very pretty little daughter called Olivia, had a housekeeper called Mrs. Everett. Mrs. Everett did all the vacuuming and cleaning, and she was a very talkative woman. So I called my character Edna. I thought, I can't call her Everett. Mrs. Everett will be offended. So I called her Edna Everidge, because Everidge also sounded very average. And I wanted this woman to be representative, really, of ordinary people. She had an imaginary husband called Norm for normal. She had 3 young children, Kenny, little Kenny she called him, a boy called Bruce, and a daughter called Valmay, who already seemed a little dysfunctional. Well, I ended up, as I said, playing this role, and it was a huge success. I went to thrift shops and I bought clothes, women's clothes that were, in fact, far too big for me. But in those days, Edna wasn't very well dressed. In fact, she was rather a frump. She was also very shy, you may find it hard to believe. She wore a pointed yellow felt hat, which my mother had once bought to go to the races. But since my mother never went to the races, the hat was never worn. I also wore what was called a twin set in those days, which is kind of a knitted cardigan with a knitted thing underneath it. Altogether, I looked pretty odd. But all Edna did when she offered up her accommodation was to talk about what a beautiful home she had. You see, my father was a builder of suburban houses, and I was very interested in the places people lived in. And to this day, whether it's in Houston, or Vancouver, or Hong Kong, or Berlin, or Miami, or New York, Edna is still very, very interested in where you live, and what color your carpet is, and what color your bedroom is, or your bathroom, or your toilet. Well, I realized I'd hit a rather rich vein of comedy. It was all about Australia, of course. Most of my act is about Australia. But I thought to myself, that was fun, but I'll never do that character again. But I never thought, in my wildest imagination, that nearly half a century later I'd be telling you about it. Over the years, I'd bring Edna out of the trunk. Of course, I did a lot of other things in the theatre. I was in musicals and other people's shows. And I invented a lot of other characters, all of them male characters. But somehow Edna was more popular, and she began to assume a life of her own. It was, as Edna would say, spooky. I found that by the 60s, Edna was getting a little hippie-ish. She'd started to wear those glasses. In the original sketch, she hadn't worn those little rhinestone glasses, but now they seemed to make her look, well, wonderfully 50s, because she's a 50s creation. She moved into tie silk. She discovered these wonderful fabrics. By the 70s, she was into denim. Soon, instead of being shy and a frump, Edna was better dressed than the best dressed woman in her audience. In the 80s, she'd undergone another transformation, and I felt it was important that Edna should look absolutely up to date. That's why footage of her always looks old-fashioned. There is, as you know, no one more old-fashioned than the woman trying to be with it.